The cargo containers came in endless rows, stacked high enough to block out the artificial sunlight that filtered through the station's massive dome windows. Daniel Cooper wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his loading manifest one more time. 3 more shipments to go before his shift ended. And then he could finally get something to eat. Nexus Station never slept. It sat at the edge of human-controlled space, like a massive metal city floating in the void, welcoming ships from 100 different worlds. Aliens of every shape and size walked its corridors, traded in its markets, and argued in its courts. For a man who had spent most of his life teaching history to high school students in a small Ohio town, it was still strange to see creatures with 4 arms or scales or tentacles going about their daily business, but Daniel had learned to adapt. That was what humans did. After all, 40 years ago, humanity had made first contact with the galactic community. 40 years was nothing in the grand scale of the universe. Most species had been traveling between stars for thousands of cycles before humans even learned to make fire. To the older races, humans were children, curious, emotional, and painfully primitive. Daniel had heard all the jokes and the insults. He had seen the way certain aliens looked at him, like he was some kind of pet that had learned a few clever tricks. It bothered him at first, but he had learned to let it go. He was here to work, to send money back home to his aging parents, and to keep his head down. Getting into arguments with aliens who thought they were better than him would not pay the bills. He pushed another container onto the transport platform and watched it float away toward the cargo bay. The work was simple, but honest. Load the containers, check the seals, scan the codes, and move on to the next one. It did not require much thought, which suited Daniel just fine. His mind could wander while his hands stayed busy. A group of Veltani walked past him, their tall insectoid bodies clicking and humming as they communicated with each other. They wore the dark uniforms of the Velton Mining Corporation, one of the largest companies operating in this sector. Daniel had learned to recognize them quickly. They controlled most of the mining operations on the outer worlds, extracting precious minerals and shipping them across the galaxy. They were rich, powerful, and not known for treating their workers well. He had heard stories in the break room, whispers about labor camps, stolen wages, and workers who simply disappeared when they complained too loudly. But those were just rumors. And Daniel had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems only led to trouble. He had enough problems of his own. His parents needed a new medical treatment that was not covered by their insurance, and he was still 3 months away from saving enough to pay for. I could not afford to lose this job. A loud crash echoed from somewhere across the loading dock, followed by shouting in a language Daniel did not recognize. Looked up and saw a crowd forming near one of the corporate offices. More drama. He thought there was always something happening on Nexus Station. Arguments over prices, disputes about shipping routes, accusations of theft. It was endless. He turned back to his work and grabbed the next container. It was heavy, filled with machine parts destined for some mining colony on the far side of the sector. He grunted as he lifted it onto the platform, his muscles straining under the weight. Humans might be considered primitive, but they were also surprisingly strong for their size. Something about growing up on a high-gravity world with a thick atmosphere made humans tougher than most species expected. Daniel had once arm wrestled a Karathi trader and won. Much to the shock of everyone watching, the Karathi had 3 arms, and he still lost. Daniel smiled at the memory and pushed the container into place. Shouting from across the dock grew louder. He tried to ignore it, but something in the tone made him pause. It was not the angry shouting of a business dispute. It sounded desperate pleading. Looked up again and saw the crowd had grown larger. Aliens of different species stood in a loose circle, watching something happen near the Velton Mining Corporation office. Most of them had their arms crossed or their appendages folded, the universal body language of people who did not want to get involved, Daniel. Understood that feeling. He felt it himself every single day, but there was something different about this situation. He could see movement at the center of the crowd. Something large and scaled and trembling. A Dracari. Daniel had seen them before on the station, though not often. They were a species that resembled the dragons from human mythology, large, powerful, covered in scales that shimmered like gemstones. But despite their fearsome appearance, the Dracari were not warriors or conquerors. They were laborers, exploited for their strength and endurance by corporations that saw them as nothing more than cheap muscle. The Dracari at the center of the crowd was on her knees. Even from this distance, Daniel could see that her scales had lost their shine. She looked thin, exhausted, and broken. A Veltani supervisor stood over her, his forearms gesturing dismissively as he spoke in rapid clicks and hums. The translation device in Daniel's ear picked up fragments of the conversation: productivity penalties, equipment damage fees, contract terms. The Dracari was begging for something, her voice cracking as she spoke. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He knew he should look away and go back to work. This was not his fight, and getting involved would only cause problems. But he could not stop watching. The crowd parted slightly, and he caught a clearer glimpse of the Dracari Fennel. She was holding something in her clawed hands, a small data tablet displaying what looked like a work contract. Her eyes were wet with tears, and her whole body shook as she pleaded with the supervisor. Daniel set down his scanner and took a step toward the crowd. He did not know why. Something inside him, something he had tried to bury for years, was waking up. His shift was not over yet, and Lavra Bennett, the dockmaster, would not be happy if she caught him wandering away from his post. But he kept walking anyway. The crowd made room for him without really noticing, their attention fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Daniel pushed through until he could see everything clearly, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The Dracari female was larger than Daniel had expected up close, easily twice his height. Even while kneeling on the cold metal floor of the station, her scales were a deep blue color, but they had faded and cracked in places, a sign of poor nutrition and exhaustion. Her wings were folded tightly against her back, and her tail curled around her body like she was trying to make herself smaller. She looked up at the Veltani supervisor with eyes full of desperation and pain. Her name was Yira Vefcon, though Daniel would not learn that until later. Right now, she was just another worker being crushed under the weight of a system designed to break her. The supervisor, a tall insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that showed no emotion, stood over her with his arms crossed. His name was Krell Tarvan, and he wore the insignia of a senior overseer for the Velton Mining Corporation. His voice was cold and mechanical as the translation device converted his clicks and hums into words Daniel could understand. Your contract clearly states that productivity penalties can be applied at the discretion of management, Krell said, his tone dripping with contempt. You failed to meet your quotas for 3 consecutive cycles, and the equipment you damaged must be paid for out of your wages. I did not damage any equipment, Ira pleaded, her voice breaking. The drill malfunctioned on its own, and I reported it immediately as required by safety protocols. The investigation found otherwise, Krell replied without hesitation. The cost of repairs has been deducted from your account, along with the productivity penalties and housing fees. But that leaves me with nothing, Ira said, her claws scraping against the floor as she tried to compose herself. I have worked for 6 cycles without a single day of rest, and I have received nothing in return. That is not my concern, Krell said, turning away slightly as if the conversation was already boring him. If you are unhappy with the terms of your contract, you are free to seek employment elsewhere. How can I seek employment elsewhere when I cannot afford transport off this station? Yura asked, her voice rising with desperation. How can I leave when my children are waiting for me to bring food? The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Daniel could see other workers in the group, some Dracari, some from other species, all of them wearing the worn expressions of people who had seen this scene play out before. None of them spoke up, none of them moved to help. Your personal circumstances are not the concern of Velton Mining Corporation, Krell said, his compound eyes fixed on Yura with cold indifference. You signed a contract, and you will fulfill its terms or face the consequences. My mate is dead, Yura said, and her voice cracked completely as she spoke. He died in the tunnels 3 months ago when the ceiling collapsed, and your company refuses to acknowledge it as a workplace accident. The investigation is ongoing, Krell replied smoothly. Until a determination is made, no compensation can be provided. There is no investigation, Yura said. And now there was anger mixing with her desperation. You buried the report because you did not want to pay his death benefits. Krell's posture stiffened for a moment. Something flickered in his compound eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or the beginning of real anger. Be careful with your accusations, he warned. Slander is a serious offense, and I would hate to add legal fees to your already substantial debt. Yura looked down at the floor, her shoulders shaking when she spoke again. Her voice was barely a whisper. I only need my wages. My children have not eaten. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Daniel felt them settle into his chest, pressing against his heart. He looked around at the crowd, waiting for someone to do something. Surely someone would speak up. Surely someone would not just stand there while a mother begged for money to feed her children. But no one moved. The other Dracari workers kept their eyes on the ground. The aliens from other species shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Even the handful of humans in the crowd, Daniel's own kind, stayed silent. One of them caught Daniel's eye and shook his head slightly. Do not get involved, the gesture said. It is not worth it. Krell let out a sound that the translator interpreted as laughter. Your children are not my responsibility, he said. Perhaps you should have considered their needs before you signed a contract you could not fulfill. He turned to walk back into the corporation office, already dismissing Yura from his mind. The crowd began to disperse. The show was over, and everyone had their own problems to worry about. Daniel watched Yura remain on the floor, her head bowed, her body trembling. She had nothing left, no wages, no mate, no hope. Her children were somewhere on this station, hungry and waiting for a mother who had nothing to give them. Daniel thought about his own parents back on Earth. He thought about how hard they had worked to raise him, how many sacrifices they had made so he could have a better life. He thought about all the times his mother had gone hungry so that he could eat. He thought about what it would feel like to have nothing to give to the people who depended on him, and something inside him snapped. It was not anger. Exactly. It was something deeper and older, something that had been sleeping inside him for years. It was the part of him that had become a teacher because he wanted to help young people find their way. It was the part of him that had once broken up a fight between two students twice his size because he could not stand to watch someone get hurt. It was the part of him that his father had always called too soft for this world. Daniel took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted around him, confused by the human moving against the flow of traffic. Krell was almost at the door of the corporation office when Daniel called out to him. Hey, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. I have a question about that contract. Krell stopped and turned slowly, his compound eyes fixed on Daniel with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. And who exactly are you? Krell asked. Nobody important, Daniel replied. Just a cargo handler with some questions. Krell's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. Then I suggest you return to your cargo. Human, this matter does not concern you. Maybe not, Daniel said, taking another step forward. But I am making it my concern. The crowd went silent. Everyone was watching now, and Daniel knew there was no turning back. Krell Torvin stared at Daniel with all four of his compound eyes, trying to process what he was seeing. A human, one of those primitive, emotional creatures from the backwater planet called Earth, was actually challenging him in public. It was almost funny. "You are making a mistake," Krell said, his translator giving his voice a cold, mechanical quality. "I suggest you walk away before you make things worse for yourself." Daniel did not walk away. Instead, he stepped closer to Yura, who was still kneeling on the floor, and offered her his hand. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. Yura looked up at him with confusion in her large golden eyes. No one had spoken to her with kindness in a very long time. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and took his hand. Daniel helped her to her feet, surprised by how light she felt despite her size. She was skin and bones under those faded scales. Whatever strength she once had was nearly gone. "Thank you," Yura whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel nodded and turned back to Krell, who was watching the scene with growing irritation. "I would like to see the contract," Daniel said calmly. "The one that allows you to take all of her wages. That is confidential corporate information," Krell replied. "You have no authority to request it." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted. "But Section 12 of the Galactic Trade Authority Labor Regulations states that any worker has the right to a full accounting of wage deductions upon request. And any third party can request an independent review if there is evidence of exploitation." The crowd murmured. Several aliens exchanged surprised glances. The human knew the labor regulations? Krell's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of agitation that even Daniel could recognize. "You are bluffing," Krell said. "No human knows the Trade Authority regulations. I read them when I arrived on the station," Daniel said with a small shrug. "I like to know my rights, and it turns out the regulations apply to all workers, not just humans." He was not bluffing. When Daniel first arrived on Nexus Station 6 months ago, he had spent his first week reading every regulation and law he could find. It was a habit from his teaching days. Always do the research before you step into a classroom. He never imagined that knowledge would be useful in a situation like this. Krell took a step toward Daniel, trying to use his height to intimidate the smaller human. "Even if you know the regulations, it does not matter," Krell hissed. "This is a private matter between the corporation and our employee, and we have lawyers who will bury any challenge in legal proceedings for years." "Maybe," Daniel said, not backing down. "But in the meantime, Section 12 also states that disputed wages must be held in escrow until the matter is resolved, which means you cannot keep her money while the investigation is ongoing." "There is no investigation," Krell snapped. "There is now," a new voice called out from the edge of the crowd. Daniel turned to see Laura Bennett pushing her way through the gathered aliens. The dockmaster was a tall woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that had seen enough trouble to last several lifetimes. She was carrying a datapad and looking at Krell with an expression that could freeze. "Water, Laura," Daniel said, relief washing over him. "I was hoping you would show up. I got a notification that one of my workers was causing a disturbance," Laura said, though there was no anger in her voice. "Imagine my surprise when I found out you were standing up to one of the most corrupt corporations on the station." She turned to Krell and held up her datapad. "I have already sent a formal complaint to Commander Soren Keth of the Trade Authority," Laura continued. "I have also attached the dock records showing that your corporation has been underreporting cargo values for the past 6 months, which suggests you have been cheating on your trade taxes." Krell's entire body went rigid. "That is a separate matter," he said quickly. "Is it?" Laura asked with a thin smile. "Because it seems to me like a pattern of fraud, and patterns tend to attract Attention from investigators. The crowd was growing. Larger now, other workers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Some of them were recording on their personal devices, Daniel could see. Other Drakkari workers at the edge of the crowd, their eyes fixed on Yura with a mixture of hope and fear. "This is outrageous," Krell sputtered. "You have no authority to interfere with corporate operations." "You are right," Lavra agreed. "But Commander Keth does. And he will be here in about 10 minutes to ask you some questions." She turned to Daniel and gave him a nod of approval. "Nice work, Cooper. I did not know you had it in you." Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Neither did I," he admitted. Ira was still standing beside him, her claws trembling as she watched the confrontation unfold. She looked at Daniel with an expression he could not quite read. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "You do not know me, and I have nothing to offer you." Daniel thought about the question for a moment. Why was he helping? It would have been so easy to walk away, to pretend he had not seen anything, to go back to loading cargo and minding his own business, but something had broken inside him when he heard Yura say those words, "My children have not eaten." He thought about his mother, who had worked double shifts at the factory so she could afford to buy him books for school. He thought about his father, who had taught him that a man's worth was measured not by what he owned but by how he treated the people who had less. He thought about all the times in his life when someone should have spoken up but did not, because it is the right thing to do, Daniel finally said, and because nobody else was going to. Yura stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she bowed her head in a gesture that Daniel instinctively understood as deep respect. "Among my people, there is a saying," she said softly. "The fire that burns in one heart can light 1,000 more." "That is a beautiful saying," Daniel replied. "It is also a warning," Yura added. And there was something like hope in her voice for the first time, because once the fire starts, it cannot be stopped. Daniel looked around at the crowd, at the workers who were watching, at the recordings being made, at the other Drakkari who were beginning to stand a little taller. He realized that this was no longer just about one mother and her children. This was about something much bigger, and he was right in the middle of it. Commander Soren Keth arrived exactly when Laura said he would. He was a Morvathia species known for their rigid adherence to laws and regulations. His body was covered in smooth gray skin, and his large black eyes swept across the scene with cold efficiency. Two enforcement officers flanked him, their hands resting on the stun weapons at their belts. "I received a complaint regarding potential labor violations," Commander Keth said, his voice deep and measured. "I am here to conduct a preliminary investigation." Krell stepped forward immediately, his posture shifting from aggressive to cooperative in an instant. "Commander, this is all a misunderstanding," Krell said smoothly. "A disgruntled worker made accusations without evidence, and these humans decided to involve themselves in matters they do not understand." "I see," Commander Keth replied. "And what matters would those be?" "Internal corporate affairs," Krell said. "Nothing that concerns the trade authority." Commander Keth turned to look at Yura, who was still standing beside Daniel. His black eyes studied her carefully, taking in her faded scales, her thin frame, and the exhaustion written across her face. "You are the worker who filed the complaint?" he asked, and Yura hesitated. Looking at Daniel for reassurance, Daniel gave her a small nod. "Yes." "Commander," Yura said, her voice stronger than before, "I have worked for the Velton Mining Corporation for 6 cycles, and I have not received a single credit in wages." "That is a serious accusation," Commander Keth said. "Do you have documentation?" "She has her contract," Daniel interjected, stepping forward. "I am willing to bet that if you compare the deductions listed in that contract to the actual work she performed, you will find significant discrepancies." Krell's mandibles clicked angrily. This human has no standing to speak on behalf of I have standing to speak on behalf of anyone I choose, Daniel interrupted calmly. Section 8 of the Trade Authority Charter guarantees the right of any citizen to advocate for workers who may be victims of exploitation. Commander Keth's expression did not change, but there was something like curiosity in his dark eyes. You know the Charter well, he observed. I read a lot. Daniel replied. The commander turned back to Krell. I will need to see the worker's contract, her wage records, and all documentation related to the deductions that have been applied to her account. That information is proprietary, Krell said quickly. Releasing it would violate corporate confidentiality agreements. Section 12 of the Labor Regulations supersedes corporate confidentiality in cases of alleged exploitation. Commander Keth replied without hesitation. You will provide the documentation, or I will obtain a warrant and seize your entire database for the first time. Real fear flickered across Krell's face. He looked around at the crowd, at the recording devices, at the other directory workers who were watching with desperate hope in their eyes. He was trapped. And he knew it very well, Krell said through clenched mandibles. I will provide the requested documentation. He gestured to one of his assistants, who hurried into the corporation office a few minutes later. The assistant returned with a datapad containing Yura's records commander. Keth took the device and began scrolling. Through the information, his expression grew darker with each passing moment. These deductions are extraordinary, he said finally. According to this, the worker owes more money to the corporation than she has earned in 6 cycles of labor. The penalties are clearly outlined in the contract, Krell insisted. She agreed to the terms when she signed. Did she understand the terms? Commander Keth asked. Was the contract provided in her native language? Krell hesitated. The standard corporate contract is written in Galactic Common, he said. It is the responsibility of the worker to understand legal terminology that most trained lawyers struggle with. Laura interrupted. Come on, Krell. Everyone knows your contracts are designed to trap workers in permanent debt. Commander Keth held up a hand for silence. I am requesting an immediate audit of all Velton Mining Corporation worker contracts, he said. In the meantime, all disputed wages will be held in escrow as required by Section 12. This is an outrage, Krell snarled. You cannot simply, I can. And I will, Commander Keth replied. Furthermore, I am launching a formal investigation into the death of Yura Vethkon's mate, which your corporation has failed to acknowledge as a workplace accident. Yura let out a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Daniel reached out and placed a hand on her arm, offering what comfort he could. You have no evidence of wrongdoing, Krell said, but his voice was weaker now. Actually, I do, Laura said, stepping forward with her datapad. I have been tracking your cargo shipments for months, and I have documentation showing that your corporation has been underreporting the value of mineral shipments by an average of 30%. She handed the datapad to Commander Keth. That is tax fraud on a massive scale, she continued. And it suggests a pattern of corporate behavior that includes worker exploitation, safety violations, and deliberate cover-ups. Commander Keth reviewed the data carefully when he looked up. His expression was grim. Supervisor Krell-Tovan, you are hereby detained pending a full investigation, he said. Officers, take him into custody. The enforcement officers moved forward and secured Krell's arms before he could react. You cannot do this, Krell shouted, struggling against their grip. I have connections at the highest levels of the Trade Authority, and I will have all of you removed from your positions. Perhaps, Commander Keth replied calmly. But until then, you will answer for your actions. As Krell was led away, the crowd erupted in murmurs and whispers. Other Drakkari workers pushed forward, their voices rising as they shared their own stories of stolen wages and impossible debts. Daniel watched the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and exhaustion he had not planned for any of this. He just wanted to help one mother feed her children. Laura walked over and stood beside him. "You know this is going to change things," she said quietly. "Word is already spreading across the station, and I'm getting messages from workers on other levels who want to know what happened. Is that a good thing?" Daniel asked. Laura smiled. "I guess we will find out." Daniel looked at Yura, who was surrounded by other Dracari workers. They were touching her shoulders and speaking to her in their own language, offering comfort and support for the first time since Daniel had seen her. Yura's scales seemed to shimmer. With just a hint of their original color, she looked up and caught Daniel's eye. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Daniel nodded and turned back to Laura. "I think I still have cargo to unload," he said. Laura laughed. "I think you have earned the rest of the day off, Cooper." 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation on the loading dock, and Nexus Station had not stopped talking about what happened. The story had spread like fire through the station's communication networks, then jumped to other stations, then to planets across the sector. "The human who fed the dragons" became the title that everyone used. Though Daniel thought it sounded ridiculous, he had not fed anyone. He had just asked some questions and refused to back down, but the galaxy did not see it that way. The investigation into Velton Mining Corporation had revealed something far worse than anyone expected. Over 400 Dracari workers had been systematically cheated out of their wages through fraudulent deductions and impossible contracts. Corporation had been stealing from them for years, knowing that no one would speak up and no one would care until a human cargo handler decided to get involved. Commander Kath had become something of a hero himself. The investigation had uncovered corruption at multiple levels of the corporation, including bribes paid to local officials and falsified safety reports that had led to dozens of preventable deaths. Grell Torvan was facing charges that would keep him in custody for a very long time, and Yura Vethkon had finally received her wages, all 6 cycles worth, plus compensation for her mate's death and damages for emotional distress. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. Daniel was sitting in the station's food court when Yura found him. She looked different. Now her scales had regained their deep blue shimmer, and she moved with a grace that had been missing when Daniel first saw her on her knees. 3 small Dracari followed behind her, their scales bright with the colors of youth. "Daniel Cooper," Yura said, her voice warm and strong. "I have been looking for you." Daniel stood up, suddenly feeling awkward. "Yura," he said, "it is good to see you looking so well." "It is because of you," Yura replied. "Everything good that has happened to me and my children is because of you." She gestured to the 3 young Dracari behind her. "These are my hatchlings," she said. "Kath is the oldest, named after the commander who brought us justice. Lyra is my daughter, and the smallest is Daniel." Daniel blinked. "Daniel?" he repeated. Yura smiled. "It is as close as our language can come to your name," she explained. "I hope you do not mind." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "I do not mind at all," he managed to say. The smallest Dracari. Young Daniel stepped forward and looked up at Daniel with wide golden eyes. "Are you the human who saved my mother?" he asked in careful Galactic common. "I just asked some questions," Daniel replied, kneeling down to be closer to the child's eye level. "Your mother did the brave thing by speaking up when no one else would." Young Daniel considered this for a moment. "Mother says that humans are different from other species," he said. "She says you have fire in your hearts that makes you do things others will not." Daniel glanced up at Yura, who was watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. "I do not know about all humans," Daniel said carefully, But I know that when someone is hurting and you can help, you should help. And that is not about being human or Dracary or any other species. That is just about being a good person, young Daniel nodded. Solemnly, I want to be like you. When I grow up, he said. Daniel felt his heart squeeze painfully. He reached out and gently touched the young Dracary's shoulder. You will be even better, he said, because you have a mother who loves you and fought for you when everything seemed impossible. Yura stepped forward and placed her clawed hand over Daniel's. Among my people, there is something called Vethkorath, she said. It is a life debt that can never be truly repaid, and from this day forward, you and your descendants are considered family to my bloodline. That is not necessary, Daniel protested. It is not about necessity, Yura replied. It is about honor, and my children will tell their children about the human who stood up when everyone else looked away. She reached into a pouch at her belt and pulled out a small crystal that glowed with a soft inner light. This is a memory stone, she explained. It contains the story of what you did, recorded in the manner of my people, and it will be passed down through generations so that your kindness is never forgotten. Daniel took the crystal carefully. It was warm against his palm, and he could feel something like a heartbeat pulsing within it. I do not know what to say, he admitted. You do not need to say anything, Yura replied. Just continue to be who you are. She gathered her children and prepared to leave. We are returning to our homeworld, she said. I have enough money now to start fresh, and my children will grow up in a place where they will never go hungry again. I am glad, Daniel said. Truly, Yura paused and looked at him one last time. The galaxy is watching now, she said. They have seen what one human can do when they choose to act. And they are beginning to understand that humanity is not defined by technology or military strength. She touched her chest, where her heart beat beneath her scales. You are defined by this, she said, by the fire that burns inside you and refuses to let injustice stand. Daniel watched as Yura and her children walked away. Disappearing into the crowds of Nexus Station, he looked down at the memory stone in his hand. Still glowing with its soft inner light, Laura appeared beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. Saying goodbye? She asked. Yeah, Daniel replied. She named one of her kids after me. Laura smiled and handed him a cup. You deserve it, Cooper. And you know, you have had about a dozen job offers since this whole thing started, including one from the Trade Authority itself. Daniel shook his head. I am not interested in being famous or powerful, he said. I just want to do my job and help where I can. Well, you might not have a choice, Laura said, because word is spreading about the human who knows the regulations and is not afraid to use them. And workers from all over the station are starting to ask questions about their own contracts. Daniel sighed and took a sip of his coffee. I suppose there are worse things than helping people understand their rights, he admitted. Laura clapped him on the shoulder. That is the spirit, she said. Now come on. We have cargo to unload. They walked back toward the loading docks together as they passed through the corridors. Daniel noticed something different. Talians, who had once looked through him, now nodded in acknowledgement. Other humans stood a little taller when they saw him pass, and in the eyes of the Dracary workers, he saw something that had not been there before. Hup Beeve, Galaxy had learned something important that day. It learned that humans were not just curious newcomers or primitive creatures stumbling through a universe. They did not understand humans were beings who carried fire in their hearts, who refused to look away when someone was suffering, and who would stand up for strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. That, Daniel realized, was something worth being known for. He smiled to himself and got back to work. After all, there was always more cargo to unload.